June 17th, 1945, Northern Germany. At precisely 04:27 on a pale summer dawn, the faint chime of a bicycle bell echoed across the abandoned village square. The cobblestones were still damp with the night's rain, reflecting the ghostly silhouettes of British patrol trucks advancing through the mist. Analisa Hoffman, once a literature teacher at the Frauenakademie of Lübeck, awoke to the mechanical rumble, her breath suspended between disbelief and recognition of the inevitable. The knock on her wooden door, when it came, was not harsh, merely deliberate, and it carried the weight of a continent's collapse. The soldier outside spoke carefully measured German, requesting her identification with a voice that betrayed exhaustion rather than triumph. His eyes avoided hers, fixed instead on the insignia still faintly visible on her classroom satchel, a relic of a regime that had dissolved in ashes. Inside, the air smelled of chalk dust and lavender soap, remnants of her final lesson before the surrender. Her colleague, Fräulein Weber, stood in the adjoining doorway clutching a Bible, whispering that perhaps this was only another inspection. Yet both women knew that the Third Reich's fall had erased such illusions forever. By sunrise, 6 women stood in the school courtyard, guarded by 3 British infantrymen, whose uniforms bore the mud of Schleswig's retreating fields. Behind them, the red brick schoolhouse loomed like a mausoleum of broken ideals, its windows shattered by artillery months earlier. The Union Jack fluttered awkwardly above the roof, not as a banner of conquest, but as a marker of order amid ruins. Annalisa's thoughts wandered toward her pupils, those who had vanished in bombings, those conscripted, those never found, and she felt a hollow gratitude that the war, at least, had ended before more could be lost. One of the officers read from a folded list, naming each woman with precise British diction that mangled their German vowels. They were accused of instructing under a government now criminal, of shaping young minds with forbidden texts, of serving without question. The words sounded distant, bureaucratic, even merciful compared to the fates rumored in the East. When the truck's engine roared to life, Annalisa lifted her eyes once toward the bell tower, where the swallows circled endlessly above the ruins. As they were driven away, the village receded into fog, leaving behind gardens untended and classrooms silent as graves. Annalisa pressed her palm against the cold steel of the truck's railing, realizing that history had reached her doorstep, not with vengeance, but with an unspoken demand for accountability. The convoy departed at dawn, beneath a sky bruised by drifting smoke, its pale light revealing a landscape stripped of sound and mercy. Along the narrow road from Lübeck to Osnabrück, villages lay flattened into splintered geometry, their steeples collapsed beside wells choked with debris. The 6 women sat shoulder to shoulder in the covered lorry, hands bound loosely with coarse rope, their faces reflecting both fatigue and disbelief at how quickly authority had turned into exile. Each mile carried them farther from everything familiar, yet nearer to a judgment none dared define aloud. Annalisa watched the horizon unfold through the slit in the canvas, glimpsing children scavenging among ruins, old men dragging carts of unburied memories, and the skeletal remains of locomotives beside silent rail lines. The countryside smelled of wet ash and horse sweat, of burned fields reclaimed by nettles and ghosts. The British escort rode ahead in jeeps marked with white stars, their engines coughing against the wind, their drivers expressionless beneath steel helmets that glinted with morning frost. No one spoke, except for brief commands over radio static, words clipped and functional, as though speech itself risked breaking the fragile order of surrender. By the 3rd day, hunger gnawed like conscience, and the prisoners shared a single loaf of rye bread, wrapped in a torn map of Mecklenburg. Fräulein Weber murmured psalms under her breath, while Hilde Kraus, the youngest among them, wept soundlessly until exhaustion turned grief into stillness. The lorry passed columns of returning soldiers, now stripped of insignia, walking eastward in ragged silence with their futures erased. From time to time, villagers emerged with white cloths tied to broom handles, signaling peace to any approaching flag, though few still believed such symbols offered protection. On the 5th morning, they crossed the Elbe near Hamburg, where pontoon bridges groaned beneath endless streams of Allied transport. The river shimmered with oil and broken timber, carrying away fragments of letters, uniforms, and drowned regret. Analisa imagined her mother's voice calling from the other shore, but the current devoured all memory before it reached her. One British officer, perhaps moved by pity, handed them a tin cup of weak tea, its warmth foreign yet strangely consoling after nights spent shivering beneath tarpaulin rain. As twilight settled over the wreckage of Bremen, the convoy halted beside a bombed-out church, whose bells still hung suspended, cracked but unfallen. There, amid silence so absolute it seemed sacred, the women realized the road westward did not lead toward freedom or punishment. It led only deeper into history's reckoning. At dawn on June 23rd, the prisoners were herded onto the steel ramp of the Liberty ship SS Samphire, its hull echoing like an iron cathedral beneath their hesitant steps. The air tasted of rust, salt, and diesel, thick with the scent of unfamiliar seas and silent apprehension. British sailors moved briskly among coils of rope and stacked crates marked with faded stencils, rations, Europe, return cargo, while gulls shrieked overhead like restless sentinels of departure. Analisa Hoffman felt the deck tremble beneath her boots as the vessel groaned to life, carrying its cargo of the conquered toward unknown shores. From the moment they left the German coast, the horizon vanished beneath a grey shroud of mist that blurred the line between water and eternity. The ship's engines beat with relentless rhythm, a mechanical pulse that drowned all speech and sleep. Below deck, the women were quartered in a narrow compartment, once meant for supplies, its air stifling with fumes and damp wool. Tin cups rattled against metal bunks as waves struck the hull, and the darkness seemed alive with whispers of guilt and memory. For 9 days they floated between nations, between crimes unnamed and destinies unspoken. Analisa kept a small notebook hidden beneath her shawl, its pages filled with trembling handwriting that recorded the voyage in fragments. She wrote of Weber's fever, of Krauss's nightmares, of the British sergeant who hummed hymns while polishing his boots beside the hatch. At night, when the Atlantic wind howled across the deck, she dreamed of her classroom's chalkboard and the laughter of children now scattered across ruins. Every dawn brought a new horizon of grey, each indistinguishable from the last, until even time lost its footing. The women began counting meals instead of days, marking existence by spoonfuls of watery stew. On the 7th evening, a storm swept through the channel, flinging the ship across monstrous swells that clawed at its flanks like unseen beasts. Lanterns swung violently, illuminating faces pale with nausea and fear, yet none screamed. There was a collective understanding that the sea itself judged them now. When calm returned, they emerged onto the deck, shivering beneath blankets, watching the stars pierce the clouds in fragile defiance. Somewhere beyond that dark expanse lay England, both destination and sentence. As dawn finally revealed a faint coastline of cliffs rising through fog, Analisa pressed her fingers against the cold railing and whispered a single thought carried by the wind. History had no mercy, but perhaps the sea, in its endless motion, forgave everything. The Liberty ship anchored beneath a sky of soft drizzle, its grey silhouette merging with the cold majesty of England's eastern coast. On the morning of July 2nd, 1945, the prisoners disembarked at Hull, greeted not by jeering crowds or armed menace, but by the quiet efficiency of British order. The harbour smelled of coal smoke and salt, the sound of distant church bells mingling with the creak of cranes unloading supplies for a world relearning how to breathe. Analisa Hoffman stepped onto the pier with legs trembling from 9 days at sea. Her heart braced for humiliation, yet met instead with restrained civility that confused more than comforted. A convoy of Bedford trucks awaited, engines idling beneath the supervision of officers wearing berets rather than helmets, their demeanor firm but not cruel. One offered the women tea before departure, poured from a dented kettle into mismatched tin cups, an act so simple it fractured every expectation they carried from a decade of propaganda. The journey inland passed through rolling fields and hedgerows shimmering with rain, landscapes untouched by the infernos that had consumed Germany. Sheep grazed among stone fences, and small cottages glowed with the unscarred warmth of survival. For the first time, Analisa understood what peace looked like when it belonged to someone else. By afternoon, they arrived at Camp 186, a former Royal Army training ground near Lodge Moor, its barbed fences enclosing neat rows of wooden huts painted in peeling green. A sign near the gate read, "Prisoner of War, Camp Number 186, Administrative Section," the words stenciled with bureaucratic precision that disguised their enormity. British guards conducted inspections politely, their hands gloved, their voices calm, their discipline suggesting authority without hatred. The prisoners were searched for contraband, issued identification cards, and assigned barracks warmed by coal stoves that hissed comfortingly against the chill. Everything was recorded, signed, and filed, a civilization rebuilding itself through the ritual of paperwork. That evening, as dusk fell over the moors, a British captain addressed them through a translator, explaining rules of conduct, work assignments, and medical care. His tone was measured, almost academic, acknowledging that these women were not soldiers, but displaced educators caught between guilt and circumstance. When he concluded, no one applauded, yet something unspoken shifted within the assembled crowd. A fragile awareness that captivity under fairness could wound deeper than chains of cruelty. As lanterns flickered across the compound and rain began tapping gently on tin roofs, Analisa lay awake listening to the rhythm of distant owls. She realized that survival here would demand more than endurance. It would require relearning humanity from those once taught to be enemies. On the 12th morning of captivity, a curious summons reached Hut 18, carried by a corporal whose politeness hinted at something unusual. The message requested the presence of the 6 German teachers in the administrative wing, where the camp's educational liaison, Mrs. Eleanor Grant, awaited. The name meant nothing to them, yet her reputation among guards spoke of intelligence softened by compassion, a rare combination in the grey machinery of post-war authority. Analisa Hoffman walked beside Fräulein Weber through corridors smelling of damp wood and disinfectant, their nerves tightening with each echoing step toward whatever fate awaited behind that oak door. Inside, the room contrasted sharply with the barracks, walls lined with maps, shelves stacked with notebooks, and a kettle humming beside a vase of fading tulips. Mrs. Grant, a woman in her 40s with kind but searching eyes, rose to greet them without ceremony, offering chairs rather than commands. She studied their faces for several moments before speaking in measured English, her words translated by an interpreter whose tone carried both warmth and gravity. She explained that hundreds of German children, displaced by bombing and border changes, had been gathered under British protection in camps and temporary homes across Europe. Many had no families left, no schools, no language of comfort beyond fear itself. The British government, she said, sought volunteers, teachers, to rebuild these children's minds before bitterness hardened into another generation of hatred. Her gaze lingered on Analisa as she asked the unthinkable. Would they, former servants of a fallen regime, become instructors once more, this time under Allied supervision, for German orphans rescued from their own nation's ruin? The silence that followed trembled with disbelief. Weber's hands clenched around her lap, while Hilda Kraus whispered that it must be a cruel test of loyalty. Annalisa's pulse quickened with conflicting memories of classrooms filled with patriotic songs, of lessons dictated by fear, of ideals she once believed noble. Mrs. Grant did not demand an answer. She simply placed a folder on the table, filled with lists of children's names and photographs marked unidentified origin. Her voice softened as she said, "Education must begin somewhere again, even among enemies." Then she left them alone with the documents, the ticking of a clock echoing through the stillness like moral thunder. When the women returned to their barracks, dusk painted the moors in fading amber, and the wind carried distant church bells from a nearby village. Analisa stared at the horizon, realizing that the greatest punishment they could receive was not confinement, but forgiveness in the form of trust. On the morning of July 15, 1945, Hut 21 had been transformed into a classroom, its wooden floors scrubbed and desks arranged from salvaged remnants, chalkboard mounted with careful precision, and sunlight slanting through repaired windows in a promise of new beginnings. Analisa Hoffman, frail in both body and spirit after months of captivity, stood beside Fräulein Weber, Freda Kleiner, and the two younger colleagues, hearts pounding as the first German children were brought in from the adjoining dormitory. Their clothing, patched and thin, bore the marks of hunger and neglect, knees protruding through trousers, elbows frayed, and eyes wide with suspicion and shock at the unfamiliarity of civility. The children entered slowly, clinging to each other or to the hands of British nurses who shepherded them into the room. Greta, a small girl of 4 with hair tangled like straw, refused to let go of the nurse's grasp, tears streaking her soot-stained cheeks. Analisa's throat tightened at the sight, every instinct screaming that these were the innocent yet irreparably damaged victims of a war she had once indirectly served through teaching. One boy, perhaps 13, strode forward with a hardened expression, eyes sharp with defiance, and demanded to know whether these women were prisoners like himself. The question cut sharply into the silence, and Analisa's voice trembled as she replied, "Yes, like you." Chaos erupted almost immediately. Pencils were thrown across the room. Children wept, some shouting, some silent, their trauma surfacing in unpredictable waves. Analisa, hands trembling, tried to impose order, yet every attempt seemed futile, each command swallowed by the weight of disbelief. Fräulein Weber comforted the smaller children, whispering reassurances through tears, while Freda Kleiner attempted to impose structure with mathematics flashcards, counting aloud to no avail. The room smelled of fear, dust, and the lingering scent of disinfectant, a reminder that the walls had witnessed both war and recovery. Hours passed with little progress, yet small moments began to glimmer. A boy who had been silent finally accepted a pencil, beginning a shaky line across a sheet of paper. Greta's grip on the nurse loosened for a fleeting moment, as Analisa crouched beside her, offering a cautious smile. The teachers realized that trust, unlike punishment, could not be demanded. It had to be earned, patiently and unevenly, through every gesture, word, and act of consistency. By the end of the first day, exhaustion pressed upon both adults and children, yet there was a fragile spark. The recognition that the classroom could become a place of safety, a place where broken lives might find structure, however tenuous. Analisa sat on a low stool, closing her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of responsibility that mingled with a dawning sense of purpose, knowing that rebuilding trust amidst ruins would take every ounce of courage they possessed. By late August 1945, the small classroom in Hut 21 had evolved from chaos into rhythm, its mornings marked by the faint chiming of a borrowed bell and the hum of hesitant voices learning again to trust words. The first weeks had stripped the women of pride, yet in its place grew something sturdier, a sense of purpose reborn from humility. Analisa Hoffman began each day with simple exercises, reading from storybooks rescued from the camp library, teaching the alphabet with chalk worn down to stubs, drawing letters as though resurrecting civilization itself from ash and silence. The children responded slowly, their suspicion melting into curiosity, their laughter returning in careful fragments like sunlight filtered through fog. Language became the bridge over their shared ruin. Fräulein Weber introduced English phrases, transforming lessons into a fragile exchange where captors' words mingled with the vanquished tongue, creating a grammar of reconciliation. The British guards often paused by open windows to listen, their faces unreadable as they watched former enemies and war's orphans rebuild meaning one syllable at a time. The classroom's walls, once echoing with cries, now carried songs, nursery rhymes first whispered, then sung aloud, filling the compound with improbable tenderness. Even the camp commandant, passing one afternoon, removed his cap respectfully before leaving them to their quiet revolution. Analisa encouraged stories rather than confessions, urging the children to speak of places they remembered before the sirens and the firestorms. Greta described a yellow house beside a river where her mother baked bread on Sundays, and though no one corrected her illusions, the tale's warmth steadied every listener. A boy named Lucas sketched airplanes in chalk, his imagination reshaping terror into fascination. Through these fragile narratives, the teachers learned that healing required imagination as much as discipline. Every lesson became an act of faith that knowledge could outlive guilt. Outside, the moors shifted toward autumn, the air scented with peat and distant rain, and evenings brought gatherings beneath lantern light where teachers read poems in both languages. British officers attended quietly, moved by a grace they could not order nor measure in reports. Mrs. Grant visited weekly, her satisfaction tempered by awe at what humanity had managed under confinement. She called it the camp school, a term that carried weight beyond its modest boundaries. By the season's end, laughter lingered longer than weeping, and the children began greeting guards without fear. The women, once defined by surrender, now found salvation in instruction, realizing that redemption did not descend as mercy. It grew patiently, wherever compassion was allowed to take root. It happened on a cold October morning, when fog drifted low across the moors and frost silvered the barbed wire like lace spun by ghosts. The camp stirred slowly, boots crunching over frozen mud, the clang of breakfast tins echoing beneath pale light. In Hut 21, the children shivered at their desks, their breath visible, their hands too numb to hold pencils steady. Analisa Hoffman moved among them, wrapping small fingers with strips of cloth torn from an old blanket, whispering encouragements in a voice that trembled between exhaustion and care. Outside, British guards marched their routine patrols, rifles slung idly, their silhouettes softened by mist that blurred the line between captor and captive. Among them was Corporal James Whitmore, a quiet Yorkshireman with a face weathered by Normandy's storms and eyes dulled by the burden of what he had seen. During supply duty that morning, he noticed Greta, the smallest of the children, standing near the gate, her thin frame wrapped in a coat several sizes too large, eyes fixed on a British truck unloading rations. Something in her gaze pierced through years of hardened obedience. Without speaking, he reached into his tunic pocket and withdrew a single bar of chocolate, slightly melted from body heat, its paper faded from months of rationing. Kneeling, he offered it with a hesitant smile and whispered, "For school." The gesture, witnessed by 2 guards and later whispered through the camp, spread faster than any order. Greta, uncertain at first, accepted the gift with both hands, staring as if holding a relic of another world. Inside the classroom, she broke it carefully into small fragments, sharing each piece among the children, saving none for herself. The sweetness, faint and almost forgotten, drew tears from those who tasted it, not for its flavor but for what it represented, the first voluntary act of kindness from the uniformed other side. Analisa watched silently, feeling her composure unravel, realizing that compassion, once forbidden, could bloom even behind fences. That afternoon, something shifted imperceptibly throughout Camp 186. Guards began greeting the teachers with restrained nods. One left a bundle of coal by the classroom door without explanation. A nurse delivered extra milk for the children's supper. No orders were given, merely quiet gestures multiplying like ripples across still water. Weeks later, Mrs. Grant remarked in her report that morale had improved without administrative intervention. What she could not quantify was the unspoken transformation, the discovery that humanity survived best not through grand policies or proclamations, but through small acts born of decency. In that single bar of chocolate lay the fragile, enduring proof that empathy, once kindled, could outlast even the ruins of war. By November's first frost, the Yorkshire wind had grown sharp enough to cut through wool, scattering dry leaves across the compound like fragments of forgotten letters. Within Camp 186, preparations began for something unprecedented, a celebration suggested by the children, approved cautiously by Mrs. Grant, and embraced hesitantly by the guards. The German festival of St. Martin, a tradition once silenced by war, would return in miniature beneath the barbed wire. Lanterns would be crafted from ration tins, paper scraps, and candle stubs gathered over weeks, symbols of light defying the season's deepening darkness. For the teachers, it felt both miraculous and dangerous, as though faith itself risked misinterpretation. Analisa Hoffman guided the children through each careful step, teaching them how to trace stars, cut shapes, and fold paper without tearing the thin material. The classroom, warmed by a single stove, smelled of wax, glue, and hope. Greta, her cheeks pink from cold, insisted on drawing doves on her lantern, though no one had seen such birds since spring. Lucas etched the outline of a horse, inspired by the legend of the saint who shared his cloak with a beggar. As the day waned, guards paused outside the windows, pretending to check the perimeter while secretly watching the quiet industry of creation. When dusk descended, the prisoners and children gathered in the yard, their lanterns flickering like constellations newly reborn. The British officers stood apart at first, hats pulled low, uncertain whether to intervene or observe. Then Mrs. Grant stepped forward, her gloved hands clasped, and softly began to hum an English hymn that blended seamlessly into the German melody the children carried. Two nations' songs weaving through the cold air as if they had always belonged together. Lanterns swayed, laughter mingled with tears, and for a brief transcendent hour, the fences surrounding Camp 186 ceased to matter. Even the sentries lowered their rifles and joined the chorus, their breath rising in pale clouds against the starlit sky. A soldier handed Lucas his flashlight, allowing the boy to project light across the snow-dusted field like a makeshift halo. Analisa, standing beside Mrs. Grant, whispered that perhaps forgiveness was not a word, but a rhythm, a willingness to share light when the world had none left. That night, as candles guttered out and darkness reclaimed the camp, an unspoken peace lingered among them all. In the silence after song, even the wind seemed gentler, carrying upward the fragile truth that humanity, once fractured, could still rebuild its moral world through acts of illumination rather than conquest. By February 1946, the moors lay buried beneath a quilt of snow, and the once bustling corridors of Camp 186 echoed with the hollow rhythm of dismantling. Wooden huts were emptied of bunks, typewriters boxed, ledgers closed with final signatures that marked the official end of confinement. The British War Office had ordered the gradual repatriation of all remaining prisoners, and though the news should have been joyous, it carried a strange melancholy that none could name aloud. For many, the camp had become paradoxically safer than the freedom awaiting beyond its gates, a fragile island of dignity carved from war's moral wreckage. Analisa Hoffman stood by the classroom window watching the last lesson conclude, her voice catching as the children recited their English farewell phrases in unison. Greta clung to her sleeve, begging to stay, while Lucas asked whether school would continue wherever they were sent. Analisa promised it would, though her heart knew promises meant little against the weight of post-war bureaucracy. Behind her, Fräulein Weber folded the final attendance sheet into a worn envelope marked to Mrs. Grant, with gratitude and hope. The air smelled of chalk and coal dust, mingled with the bittersweet scent of completion. That afternoon, Mrs. Grant gathered the teachers in the administrative hut for one final meeting, her tone measured, but eyes glistening. She explained that Britain could not keep them indefinitely, yet offered an alternative few expected: voluntary relocation to assist in rebuilding German schools under Allied supervision. They could choose repatriation, anonymity, or service, a path toward redemption through knowledge rather than denial. Silence followed her words, the kind that tests conviction. Fräulein Weber, her faith unshaken, chose return to Hanover. Freda Kleine opted for exile, determined to seek work in Belgium's Reconstruction Corps. Analisa hesitated longest, torn between the ghosts of her homeland and the fragile peace she had found through teaching. That night, she walked the perimeter fence one final time, snow crunching beneath her boots, the stars bright above the darkened watchtowers. In that stillness, she realized the war truly ended, not with surrender or treaty, but when people began choosing compassion over obedience. Her decision came quietly, without ceremony. She would remain with Mrs. Grant's mission, teaching wherever the displaced needed words to reclaim their humanity. When dawn arrived, the convoy rolled out through the gates, leaving footprints that the wind soon erased. Behind them, Camp 186 stood empty, but not forgotten. Its legacy etched not in walls or records, but in the moral awakening of those who discovered freedom's truest form lay in service, not survival. By the spring of 1973, London's rain still fell with the same measured melancholy that had greeted every April since the war's end. Analisa Hoffman, now 70 and teaching languages at a modest college in Kent, lived quietly among her books and roses, the rhythm of her days marked by letters, lessons, and the careful tending of memory. One morning, as mist drifted across the garden wall, the postman delivered an envelope bearing a Berlin return address written in familiar, trembling script. It was from Greta Vogel, once the orphaned girl who had drawn doves on her lantern in Camp 186. The moment Analisa saw the handwriting, decades folded inward, carrying her back to Yorkshire's cold yards and the soft, unsteady songs of forgiveness once sung under barbed wire. Greta's letter spoke of her life rebuilt in a divided Germany, her work as a teacher near the wall, and her enduring search for moral clarity amid political fracture. She had recently found an old photograph, Analisa standing beside Mrs. Grant and a row of lantern-bearing children, and felt compelled to write, not out of nostalgia, but gratitude. "You taught us," Greta wrote, "that kindness is not weakness, but a form of resistance." Her words struck with quiet force, reviving memories Analisa had long folded away, of guards turned mentors, of sorrow transformed through purpose, of forgiveness learned in captivity's most unlikely sanctuary. As rain brushed against the window pane, Analisa sat at her writing desk, the letter trembling slightly in her aged hands. The faces of her fellow teachers returned to her mind. Frida in Belgium, Weber lost somewhere in post-war Hanover, Mrs. Grant, whose obituary she had once clipped but never read aloud. All had carried the burden of survival differently, yet each had participated in a quiet moral rebirth that defied the logic of war. She realized then that mercy, once sown in a campyard's frozen soil, had taken root across continents, growing unseen in the lives of those who refused to let bitterness define history's aftermath. That evening, Analisa wrote her reply slowly, every sentence carrying the weight of reconciliation earned through time. "The fences," she wrote, "were not where our captivity ended, but where our humanity began." When she sealed the envelope, the rain had ceased, leaving the world washed and still. Outside, a single bird sang in the twilight, its clear, unwavering voice echoing the enduring truth that forgiveness, once learned, never truly fades. It merely waits to be remembered. History remembers the great battles, the treaties, and the shifting borders that marked Europe's turbulent mid-century, yet the quiet revolutions of mercy remain largely unwritten. Camp 186, once a minor administrative entry in Britain's vast network of post-war facilities, became one such forgotten chapter where compassion dared to defy vengeance. Within its wooden fences, former enemies rebuilt the moral architecture of a broken world not through ideology or command, but through patience, teaching, and forgiveness. The story of that camp, scattered across diaries, letters, and oral accounts, reveals that redemption was neither granted by victors nor begged by the defeated. It was mutually discovered through shared endurance. In post-war reports, British officials recorded Camp 186 as a model of humane re-education, yet such bureaucratic phrasing concealed the deeper transformation that occurred. The teachers who once feared humiliation became agents of renewal, and the officers who enforced order learned gentleness as a new discipline. Children, once mute from trauma, spoke in two languages, bridging the silence left by lost generations. Decades later, Historians tracing the lineage of Anglo-German reconciliation would quietly cite the camp's education initiative as one of the first post-conflict programs to emphasize moral rather than political rehabilitation, a subtle but profound shift in the architecture of peace-building. Analisa Hoffman's later writings, preserved in a slim volume titled Lessons from Captivity, described how compassion had become the last act of defiance in a century ruled by cruelty. "We were prisoners," she wrote, "until the day we chose to forgive. Then the world itself became open again." Her words, read by post-war scholars and descendants of both sides, reshaped how history framed culpability, not as a weight to be carried indefinitely, but as a responsibility to transform pain into moral intelligence. The small acts, sharing food, teaching a song, lighting a lantern, proved that dignity could survive even the ashes of annihilation. Today, no structures remain of Camp 186. Grass covers the ground where children once sang in broken harmony, and wind moves freely through the empty field once bound by fences. Yet beneath that soil lies something indelible, the evidence that mercy, once practiced without expectation, can outlast every war, every wall, every cycle of reprisal. The legacy of Camp 186 endures not in monuments or medals, but in the invisible continuity of empathy, passed from generation to generation, an eternal reminder that true victory belongs not to those who conquer, but to those who forgive.